My new book, Awake, Observe, Shape, Transform, is now available on Amazon, along with the 90-day transformation journal. You'll find a link to these things in the episode description. Also, if you'd like to support this work, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers with no locked content, just a way to say I value this. You can also visit the site and check out the growing merch store, shirts, tanks, hats, and learn about one-on-one sessions with me by clicking the About button. And don't forget, the YouTube page has the podcast and binaural beats for meditation, rest, and sleep. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today I want to talk to you about something that has gnawed at me for years. I've tried to do episodes about this in the past, but I just couldn't seem to couch it in a way that did not turn into me ranting. So in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about the word Lucifer, which in Latin means the morning star, the bearer of light, not the cartoon devil, not the red guy with a pitchfork, but the light bringer. But more broadly, what I want to talk about is this strange pattern that runs through religious history where beings, or characters if you like, that were once seen as helpers, guides, or teachers of humanity slowly became these cautionary figures of our stories. The Anunnaki of Sumer, the Asuras of India, the Titans and Prometheus of Greece, the Watchers, the Book of Enoch, and finally the word Lucifer itself. All of them in their original forms were not the enemies of mankind. They were the bringers of knowledge, symbols of power, or cosmic forces of order. But along the way, something happened. Somewhere along the way, those who offered humanity the tools to think for itself, to awaken, and to grow were rewritten as threats or literary finger wags. And my intention here is not to stir controversy for the sake of it, but to question the deeper why. Why did cultures all over the world at different times start portraying knowledge as dangerous? Why was curiosity, the very thing that defines us as human beings, recast as rebellion, as defiance? That's the thread I want to follow today. So let's finally do it. Lucifer, the light bringer, and the war on human freedom. I've wanted to do this episode for years. Personally, the last two have been the most beautiful years of my life and the most challenging that I've experienced. And thanks to my wife, Christy, there's not only a renewed faith in God, but deeper questions about God itself. What is God? If God is omnipresent, right, then where does God stop and start? Does God stop just shy of the people that we dislike the most? Or is it truly as above, so below, as within, so without? So this episode is the result of me digging deep and becoming more curious than ever. And honestly, in light of everything happening culturally, I believe this is the perfect time for me to ask these questions. Because for me, this isn't just about spiritual seeking. It's about something deeper. Something that is so deep that I'm not even sure what it is anymore. But I feel drawn to this topic. This has been rolling around in my mind for years. There is just something about the original concept of the word Lucifer that has always appealed to me. And it appeals to me on a level that is so deep that I have trouble expressing it. But it just aligns with me. Years ago, I took refuge in the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism and was given the name Karma Chochi Jinpa by my teacher's teacher, a man named Khenpo Carter Rinpoche. Now, the name Karma Chochi Jinpa means Dharma generosity. And my direct teacher, Lama Losan, he knew me really well. He knew how I was, he understood me, but Rinpoche didn't. He'd never really met me. I mean, I'd been around when he was visiting. It's not a massive community, but that's about it. we'd never had like any deep conversations or anything like that. But when I received that name and I saw what it meant, I thought, he must just pull these out of a hat, because at the time I wasn't teaching anyone anything, right? I was still doing graphic design. I don't even think I had the Infinite Spark of Being Tumblr blog. I was just a guy doing other stuff. Well, fast forward a number of years, I'm working in treatment, and I'm guiding people through meditation. I'm teaching Buddhist Dharma to a bunch of drug addicts and alcoholics. Well, one day I drove the 4 hours north to see Lama Losan, and by that time he knew what I was doing for a living. And I asked him, I said, when we get these names, how does Rinpoche pick them? And Lama Losan said, he just knows. And I thought that was so odd, right? Because you always hear about people getting these names, and when I look back, I think, oh, these people kind of took on these qualities, which I found very interesting. Now, to add even more synchronicity to this, at one point I was learning and practicing what's known as the Medicine Buddha Sadhana. And I was doing it with Lama Losan because that was his practice. And Lama Losan would always say, you do the Dharma that's in front of you. So I did. Well, this is interesting because the Medicine Buddha is commonly known as the Buddha of mental health. So again, it's just all this stuff kind of coming to fruition. Now, what I've noticed over the years is my desire to tell people things that will wake them up now, not later when they get their major reward. And yes, that is a Christmas story reference, so Merry Christmas. But also, but to get them now, in this life, in this birth, to wake up to the fact that we do not have to be beholden to a control system that has been programmed into our thinking, and even into the way we think about life, right? About the world, about who we are, about what we're entitled to, and what we can and cannot experience. This is my motivation in writing the most recent book, especially. I mean, it's a breakdown of what this thing is. So I feel a deep affinity for these archetypes like Lucifer and Prometheus, these beings that have sought to help humanity, but are later villainized by the power structure. So needless to say, this will be a long episode, and I believe an important and educational one. So it's my belief that the human incarnation awakens spiritually through storytelling. The reason for these texts and these stories is to remind us of the truth of things, a la Joseph Campbell and his thoughts on myth. This episode has no answers. It's just meant to make you think, make you question, because the second you stop questioning, you cease to be a human. You are now a meat automaton. So if you look across time, from the Rig Veda in India to Hesiod's Theogony, to the Book of Enoch, to the Christian canon, you start to see the same rhythm. And it begins with a being of light or wisdom, a god, a titan, an angel, someone who gives humanity a gift, right? Fire, knowledge, language, magic, self-awareness, whatever. I'm speaking broadly, of course, but at first these figures are celebrated. They're honored as the ones who bridge heaven and earth, who bring divine insight to the human world, but then something shifts, the story changes. And that same figure, the one who brought the knowledge, becomes a symbol of disobedience, a symbol of pride, a symbol of corruption, right? Prometheus gives fire to mankind and is chained to a rock for eternity. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch, sent to watch over humanity and end up teaching humanity the sciences, and then they're cast out of heaven for teaching humans and falling in love with them, right? This is interesting to me, that why would knowledge be the thing, right? Why would sharing knowledge be the thing that damns you, right? So this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's cultural, it's gradual, and it mirrors the evolution of civilization itself. As small free societies grow into empires, empires need obedience to survive. When the power structure becomes centralized, stories about independent thinkers and knowledge bringers become dangerous because knowledge, like real knowledge, gives people the ability to question, to look at the priest, the king, the law, and say, why? Just why? It's not a defiant thing to ask why, but just tell me why and make it make sense. And if it ends with, because I told you so, or because we're a nation of laws, then it's bullshit. I already had parents. I don't need more of them. Asking why isn't meant to be defiant. It's just common courtesy. Like, I'll change offices again, but if you could just throw a little line in that email that says why, then it lands a little better. But natural-born tyrants don't think that way, do they? And so the stories about these figures, these beings, start to change. The gods become jealous, right? The bringers of light become traitors. And the human mind, the very thing that connects us to the divine, becomes something that must be controlled. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a psychological and cultural pattern that shows up again and again. It's as if the collective psyche of humanity goes through waves of openness and waves of repression. So, first, we open to the mysteries, right? Then we build walls around them. And every time those walls go up, someone shows up. Someone or something to bring the light back in. That's what this episode is about. It's not about worshiping a rebel god or taking sides in a myth. It's about recognizing that light, that knowledge, awareness, consciousness has always been a threat to a control system. And the beings who carry that light in every tradition eventually get demonized for it. Across history, the same thing happens. A being brings light, knowledge, awareness, and gets punished for it. Prometheus is chained. The Watchers are cast out. Lucifer falls. It's not the light that's dangerous. It's what happens when someone tries to keep you from seeing it. That is dangerous. Those people are dangerous. So, if we're going to understand where this pattern starts, we have to go way back. Long before Christianity, long before Greece, all the way back to ancient India, to the earliest layers of the Vedas, to the word Asura. So the word Asura shows up in the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest known spiritual texts on the planet, written somewhere around 1500 BC. And here's the thing, the Asuras weren't demons, not at all. In the earliest hymns, the term Asura meant Lord, powerful being, or divine authority. It was a title of respect. Varuna, the god of cosmic law and order, is called Asura. Agni, the god of fire, is called Asura. Even Mitra, the deity of friendship and contracts, bears the title Asura. So what changed? Well, somewhere between 1000 BCE and 600 BCE, a moral polarity starts to form. Okay, the Devas, once just another class of divine beings, begin to represent order, light, and cosmic law, while the Asuras are slowly recast as their rivals, their opposites. So by the time you reach the Mahabharata and the Puranas, centuries later, the Asuras have gone from being respected cosmic powers to full-on enemies of the gods, driven by desire, envy, and arrogance. But this wasn't just a random shift in storytelling. It mirrored a shift in society. India was changing. The Vedic world was evolving from small tribal systems into structured kingdoms. Religious life was becoming more centralized, more codified. Priests and rulers started to define who could have access to spiritual knowledge and how. So the myth had to evolve to reflect that. Suddenly, anyone or anything that sought direct access to the divine power without going through the proper hierarchy was dangerous. It was against the gods. And who were the Asuras in those older stories? Well, they were the ones who questioned, right? Who sought wisdom on their own, who performed austerities, who challenged the Devas and sometimes even won. That's not evil. That's nonconformity. The beings once praised for their discipline and insight were turned into monsters because they represented a kind of spiritual independence that no empire could tolerate. And they didn't need people worshiping Asuras or even idolizing them. That's where the template is born. The independent seeker becomes the villain, the challenger becomes the enemy, and obedience becomes the highest virtue. What's wild is that this same pattern will unfold again in Greece, the Middle East, Christianity. You can trace it like a wave moving through time, a slow, deliberate inversion of meaning. In India, the Asuras go from divine power to demons. And in Greece, the Titans go from the ancestor gods to criminals. In the Near East, Watchers that were just, there to watch humanity and give people talents, go from being teachers to fallen angels. And in the West, the word Lucifer, which means light bringer, which was a word for Venus, starts to mean the devil, right? It's not a coincidence. It's cultural conditioning repeated across millennia. And what ties all of them together is this. Every single one of these figures represents access to divine knowledge without permission, and they don't like that. Now, if the Asuras show us the first example of rebellion that gets rewritten as evil and defiant, then the Greek Titans show us how that same theme takes on a psychological depth, one that hits right at the core of what it means to be a person. So as the story goes, long before Zeus sat on his golden throne on Mount Olympus, there were the Titans. These were the elder gods. They were the creator gods. They shaped the cosmos. They weren't evil. They were just ancient. They were forces of creation. They were forces of destruction. They created balance. But when Zeus and his generation rose up against them, the story changed. The old powers were framed by the storytellers, right? The power structure as chaotic, corrupt, and unfit to rule. You have to really understand that these religious tales were told in order not only to teach, but to explain law and morality to the populace. So these stories evolving this way are a very interesting artifact to take a look at. Now, at the center of all of this Greek mythology is Prometheus, one of the few Titans who actually sided with humanity. Why? Because he created mankind. He gave men form. He gave them thought. He gave them awareness. But when he sees them suffering, when he sees his creation suffering, shivering in the cold, lost in the darkness, he does something unthinkable. He defies Zeus. He goes against the control system, against the matrix, and steals fire from the heavens and gives it to men. Now, fire here isn't just literal fire like flames. It's consciousness. It's knowledge. It's the light of awareness, the same light that the Watchers would later attempt to bring mankind. So Prometheus gave mankind the spark that allowed them to cook, build, think, and eventually question. And for that, he is punished. Zeus chains him to a rock where an eagle eats out his liver every day only for it to grow back at night so that they can start the whole thing again. So why the liver? The liver represents vitality. It represents intuition and emotion, the most interesting being intuition. The ability to see ahead. Prometheus actually means forethought. Fascinating. Unlike his brother Epithemius, which means afterthought. So another side note here, the Greeks used the liver for divination. So the liver is a very strong symbol here. And make no mistake about it, there's a message being made by the powers that be. The message is, don't you worry about what's going to happen. We know what's best. Just let us drive. So what happens to Prometheus in the story, it's not justice, it's a warning. It's the ancient world's way of saying, don't reach too high, don't challenge the gods, stay in your lane. And if you are part of the priestly class, with all the influence they held and still hold over politicians and the rule makers, then this is an important point to get across to these people, right? So what happens next is exactly what happens everywhere else. Over time, the story is retold, it becomes moralized. Prometheus, once a cultural hero, the friend of mankind, becomes a cautionary tale about arrogance and disobedience. Zeus becomes the divine authority, and humanity learns once again that enlightenment comes at a price. It's almost as if the myth is whispering to us, knowledge will cost you. And that's the psychological brilliance of it. This isn't just mythology. This is a map of human development. It's what happens internally when the mind begins to wake up. Every one of us has a Promethean impulse, that inner voice that says, I need to know. I want to understand. I'm not satisfied with being told what's true. And every time that voice rises, the inner Zeus, the authority, the structure, the conditioning, the conscious mind, the carnal mind, the mind of the scared small self, tries to chain it back down. This is why the Prometheus story is timeless, because it's about you. It's about the part of you that brings light into the dark corners of your own life, even when it hurts, right? Even when it's too painful to look at what's there. Prometheus didn't steal fire just so he could warm our hands. He gave us the fire of awareness, the fire of consciousness, and that's why he was punished. So the story isn't really about gods and titans. It's about what happens every time you try to wake up, but that part of you that wants to stay asleep fights back. Moreover, it's about the threat that a free mind poses to a power structure. And this goes back to what I've written about in the past. Meditation, a tame mind, a disciplined mind, is an act of political and social rebellion. It steps outside of consensus reality. We get a whiff of the feast, as some would say, and after that, we can't forget it. We get a higher taste. Well, that's the apocalyptic parting of the veil. That's what apocalypse means. It means to part the veil. Okay, well, the veil between what? The veil between real truth, capital T, and borrowed manufactured truth? I don't know. I mean, if I say the words part the veil, you don't have an adverse reaction to that. In fact, most of you probably welcome that sort of an experience. However, if I say the apocalypse or apocalyptic, most do have an adverse reaction. In fact, even if you are one of the few that know the meaning of the word apocalypse, you've still joked about something being apocalyptic, and it was bad. You made the joke. You reinforced it. And this is what I mean by inverting the meaning. Down becomes up. Up becomes down. You can elaborate from, right? Like you get it. You see where this goes. And since the material world, the world that we have to exist in and move through and use as our spiritual exercise, right? The human birth interacting with the material world is a spiritual exercise. Since the material world is made up of words, it's made up of language, changing that meaning is a very powerful tool of control. And it affects us spiritually. So Prometheus is the mythic ancestor of the character Lucifer, and maybe even the Watchers of the Book of Enoch. All beings who dared to share forbidden light, or any light. And like the Asuras before them, they didn't bring chaos, right? They brought knowledge. But once knowledge is out, it can't be contained. You can't unknow something. You can't unsee something. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves here, I got to backtrack just a little bit. Because we can't talk about any of this without getting into one of the most famous storylines ever, thanks to, my favorite show, Ancient Aliens, where many of our most ill-informed make references to texts that they've clearly never read and draw correlations between things that strain to connect like a bunch of schizophrenics that have gone off their meds. So before the Watchers, before Prometheus, before the caricature of Lucifer, there were the Anunnaki, the oldest gods. Their story comes from Sumer, cradle of civilization, 5,000 years ago or something, in Mesopotamia, what we call Iraq now. So the Anunnaki were said to be the greatest beings who ever came from the heavens to shape Earth and guide humanity. And depending on which tablet you read, they didn't all agree on how to do that. It's the same pattern again here, right? One group of divine beings tries to preserve order, some obedience and some level of control, and then another group seeking to share knowledge, to free humanity. So in the Atrahasis epic and later in the Babylonian myths, there's a figure named Enlil, Enlil, and he's the commander of heaven. And then there's his half-brother Enki, Enki. He's the god of water, the god of wisdom, creation, much like the previously mentioned Varuna from the Vedas. Well, Enlil represents authority. He's top-down, right? The top-down order of heaven. Enki represents the insight, right? The bottom-up intelligence of the earth. So when Enlil gets sick of people, he decides to destroy them with a great flood. But Enki's compassionate, and he secretly warns Atrahasis, this human. He tells him to build a giant vessel, a boat. So he tells him that, so he preserves life. They can start again. That sounds familiar. Obviously, that's the blueprint for Noah and the Watchers, even for Prometheus and fire. So Enki becomes the first mythic rebel, the god who defies law not out of pride, not out of defiance, but really out of compassion. He doesn't want to rule humanity. He wants to teach them. And this is a theme that we see over and over again in these stories. One faction wants control, while another one wants to give freedom. Now, is the freedom that they're attempting to bestow onto humans, is it dangerous? Yes, of course it is. But you have to ask yourself, do you want safety or do you want freedom? So in the Sumerian accounts, Enki creates humans by mixing divine blood and the clay of the earth, a literal fusion of heaven and matter. That's the same act of forbidden creation that gets the Watchers condemned and Prometheus chained. It's the first version of the same archetypical divide, right? One god guards the gates of heaven, the other one opens them, which puts humanity right in the middle, trying to figure out which one to listen to. And I believe that we are still in that kind of thing today. It's hard not to talk about, it's hard to get specific without being a little weird. So maybe that's another episode. Anyway, so this story of the Anunnaki is where we first see the idea of a divided divinity, right? Where the god of law and the god of love split into two opposing currents. From that point forward, every culture tells the same story under different names. Enlil and Enki, Zeus and Prometheus, Yahweh and Samyaza, the Devas and the Asuras. One demands obedience, the other one offers understanding. One says, don't eat the fruit. The other says, taste it and see. Growth, evolution, knowledge, these things don't flourish in a safe, controlled environment. Now, if you look closely, Enki's compassion becomes the prototype for every fallen or rebellious being who acts out of mercy instead of pride. And you notice that that mercy is characterized as pride, as if to say, who do you think you are? I was going to let them suffer. Why would you stop me? That's a very strange thing. But Enki's the god who breaks the rules to save humanity, and then he's punished for it. That's the moment that the mythology of control is born, right? When the light of wisdom is framed as disobedience and compassion becomes a crime. Now, you can attempt to read these as historical events that seem to play out over and over and over through time, which I guess is possible. I mean, it's not like we don't see this playing out in politics and even in the founding of America. I mean, you could spend all of your time and money proving that the Shroud of Turin is real and finding the Ark and fighting over fucking mud buildings with people in the Middle East. Or you could see it as a way that the storytellers, or the ones controlling the storytellers, were using these stories to create a control system. By the way, this might sting, but the Shroud of Turin isn't a unique item. I mean, it is in Christianity, I guess, but in other religious systems, it's not. They have similar unexplainable anomalous artifacts. It's part of a thread that runs through everything. Bones and organs that don't burn, levitation, it's all there. It's in all of the religious systems. But what's more interesting to me isn't which club got it right, but the fact that they are all tapping into the same power. And the good news being that there seems to be multiple methods for whatever your proclivities might be. That's a cool thing. This thing where people get hung up on their little artifact of being the proof that their fucking thing is correct is so exhausting. So anyway, in the Sumerian myths, Enlil wanted to destroy humanity, but Enki disobeyed him to save it. That was 5,000 years ago, the first time light defied authority. The names have changed, but the story never did. And this brings us to the next story in this long global pattern. The Watchers of the Book of Enoch, the angels who descended to earth not out of rebellion, but out of compassion and paid the price for falling in love and giving humanity wisdom. So let's pick back up with the Book of Enoch. This text doesn't make it into the modern Bible, obviously, but it was widely read and respected by early Jewish and Christian communities. It's still part of the Ethiopian Bible, which is actually the oldest canon that's still being used. The Book of Enoch gives us a version of the fallen angels that's much older and much stranger than what any of us were ever taught in church. So why didn't it make the canon? Well, I have a theory, and my theory is that if you read it, even though Enoch is painting the Watchers as defiant, rebellious angels, most readers would be sympathetic to the Watchers. I mean, anyone seeking freedom from an oppressive, tyrannical force would feel a level of sympathy towards these benevolent beings whose greatest sin was falling in love with human women while also giving us skills to survive, which, I mean, it's not that crazy. Within Hinduism, gods and humans often had relationships. Some of Hinduism's greatest heroes were fathered by the gods. Arjuna himself was the son of Indra, as his father Pandu was unable to, quote unquote, enjoy his wives due to a curse. You see, Pandu killed a deer that was about to have sex with another deer, but the deer was actually a very powerful yogi that had morphed into a deer to have sex with his wife, who was cursed to be a deer. So things are complicated, obviously. I mean, Mondays. So within the Christian story, the angels are told by God to serve humans, God's most beloved creation. So why wouldn't they fall in love with us? I do not believe that they were just a bunch of deviant perverts as they get portrayed, for the simple fact that they aren't ever described that way. In fact, we are told that they don't have any will of their own. So which is it? Are they deviant perverts, or do they not have will of their own? I mean, if you're going to write a story, there has to be continuity for the abilities of the characters. Batman had to have a suit made of kryptonite to defeat and kill Superman. Batman couldn't defeat Superman with weapons or force. He's fucking Superman. The fantasy has to make sense or you're going to lose the audience. Anyway, so why remove the Book of Enoch from the Bible? Well, most Christian scholars would say that it's simply unimportant. They would say that Enoch was not an important figure in the history of Christianity, even though he is mentioned several times in the Bible as one of two men that ascended to heaven without facing death, and is also one of the quote-unquote two witnesses of the book of Revelation. Now, there is, of course, debate as to who the two quote-unquote witnesses are, but I believe, as did Bishop Hippolytus of Rome, that the two witnesses referred to in the book of Revelation are Enoch and Elijah. But what does it say in our traditional Bible? Well, I'm going to read all of the verses. They aren't exciting, but we're here, and I'm trying to make a point. So here we go. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 5 through 6. By faith, Enoch was taken away so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had taken him. For before he was taken, he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Genesis chapter 5, verse 21 through 24. Enoch lived 65 years and begot Methuselah. After he begot Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years, and he had sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Jude chapter 1, verse 14 through 15. Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them for all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Genesis chapter 5, verse 18 through 19. Jared lived 162 years and begot Enoch. After he begot Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had sons and daughters. So, you'd think that a character that didn't die but instead ascended to God without death would be important. I mean, it sounds interesting to me, considering Jesus died but Enoch didn't. Anyway, according to Enoch, a group of 200 angels called the Watchers, led by an angel named Semyaza, who were tasked with watching over humans, descended to earth. And it's important to understand that they weren't rebels led by Lucifer. Lucifer doesn't get mentioned in Enoch. Why? Because Lucifer hadn't been invented yet. They were led by Semyaza, because I find this interesting because as a child, I was told that Lucifer was the most attractive angel and that he led this revolt against God, and then God got mad and kicked everybody out of heaven. But that's not what happened. Like, the Watchers didn't come to overthrow God. They came to earth because they loved humanity. They were fascinated by us, by our capacity for creativity and emotion. And again, why wouldn't they be? They loved God, so why wouldn't they be fascinated by God's creation that they were tasked with serving? I mean, on one hand, do they have their own will or do they not have their own will? Okay, and also, while we're on the subject, how do we know Enoch was a good guy? We don't know shit about Enoch. We assume that everyone that writes these things is a good guy. Maybe Enoch's a fucking asshole. And I'm judging that based on the tone this guy takes when he writes the Book of Enoch. But the Watchers crossed boundaries that apparently they weren't allowed to cross by teaching us things. They taught us metallurgy. They taught us about herbs and growing herbs and harvesting herbs. They taught us about astrology. They taught us about astronomy, writing, language, the use of cosmetics. Yes, cosmetics. Meteorology. They taught us about the sun and the use of what the texts call charms and enchantments. And that's what we might refer to as ritual or magic. So these weren't acts of evil. They were acts of education. The Watchers gave humanity the tools of civilization, the way Prometheus gave fire, right? But in the story, this generosity gets labeled as corruption by the power structure. Again, why are we assuming Enoch is a good guy? Why are we assuming that the good guys, and the bad guys are the bad guys? Not to pull a full Gnostic thing on y'all, but anyway, so these archangels that stayed loyal to God accuse the Watchers of disrupting divine order because they taught humans, quote unquote, the secrets of heaven. Metallurgy, herbology, cosmetics. Guess those are the secrets of heaven. And for that, they are cast down and bound in the dark places of the earth until the day of judgment. So it's one of the most revealing patterns in all of mythology. Knowledge becomes sin, curiosity is transgression, and the teachers become fallen ones. I mean, who does it sound like is acting in the best interest of humanity in these stories? I'm a human. And I understand the evangelical response of, well, you're like a little child and you don't know what's good for you. Would you let a little girl just eat her boogers? It's like, dude, this is a little different. I'm sorry. I always love when you get like the raising a child analogy from a churchgoer when you question any of these things. But something to remember about this Enoch thing is that this is happening centuries before Christianity even existed. This is a Jewish text written during the time of the empire when local spiritual traditions were being absorbed and standardized under local political systems. Political systems absorbed and standardized under political systems. And right there at the heart of it, you see the fear of unregulated knowledge. The message is clear. Only priests can interpret the mysteries. Only the sanctioned can touch the divine. And this should sound extremely familiar. Now, before we go any further into the story of Lucifer as the light bringer, we need to clear up one of the biggest misconceptions in the entire history of spirituality. The idea that Lucifer, Satan, and the quote-unquote devil are the same being, because they're not even close. They come from different languages, different centuries, different mythologies, and different agendas. And understanding the difference is important here because it shows the mechanics of how spiritual symbols get fucking hijacked, rewritten, and weaponized. It shows how cultural power can take a figure of illumination and turn him into the definition of evil. Think about that for a second. Prometheus, cautionary tale. The words light bringer, light bearer turned into bad things. It's a bad word, Lucifer. The snake that wants to, or the serpent rather, because who knows? Could have just been a legless, I don't know. But the thing that tells Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge. And then the Elohim, which is a plural word, but for whatever reason we're told it's not, says they can't do that because they're going to be like us. This is something very interesting to me. I think we're missing something in all of this. Lucifer is not a demon. Lucifer is not Satan. Lucifer isn't even a character in the early texts. Lucifer is a Latin word meaning light bringer, used to refer to the planet Venus when it rises as the morning star. It's supposedly the last quote-unquote star you can see in the sky before sunrise. And it appears one time in Scripture, Isaiah 14:12, and even there it's a poetic insult toward a Babylonian king because his pride was his downfall. It was more like a joke. It's political satire. It's not theology. And this, to me, is kind of telling. The blurriness of these Abrahamic religions and politics, it's a lot to me. I mean, Lucifer only becomes a quote-unquote fallen angel centuries after, when Christians combine Isaiah with the story of the Watchers in Enoch and the serpent in Genesis. Originally, Lucifer was just a symbol of radiance, the light before the dawn. So Satan, quote-unquote Satan, isn't a name. It's actually a job title. It's a job title in ancient Hebrew. It means the accuser, the challenger, the prosecutor. Fun fact, in the Old Testament, the figure called Satan is not even God's enemy. He works for God. He's not the same as Lucifer. His job is to test humans, to expose their ego and hypocrisy. He is like this divine quality control inspector. There's no fall, no rebellion, no horns, no tail. I mean, the idea of Satan as this cosmic villain only appears after Judaism encounters what's called Persian dualism or Zoroastrianism, which prompted later Christian writers to reinterpret the whole thing entirely. And I'm not saying this to be smug, but this whole thing about this whole, like, trying to understand God is just easier if there's a bad guy. It allows for the power structure, the early church, because, the contemporary church would never do such a thing. It allows them to put in place this kind of control system that the population will buy into. This way, if little Johnny asks, back in the old days, he was like, hey, if God loves me, why did he created everything? Why does he let me get sick after I cut my leg in the forest? As he gasps painfully in his straw bed. Now, the adults, quote-unquote adults in the room, can say, well, that's because Satan creates germs, Johnny. And then little Johnny says, so God is letting Satan kill me? Quiet, Johnny. You've got a fever. You should rest. Then the adults gather in a room next door, and since they've bought into the bullshit as well, they say, clearly the boy's possessed by Satan. Why else would he ask these crazy questions? And then they go get a priest to exorcise the boy before he dies, which could be any minute now, because back then you died from a cut on the leg. But then Dad goes, well, I mean, he's not wrong. And then everybody gasps, oh shit, Dad's got a case of the question demon too. So we'll tie him to a chair, and he lacks faith. We'll get a priest for him too. Now, this is really only an issue in Western and Middle Eastern religions. This isn't really a problem in all religions. Remember, the Bible has been rewritten a couple times. I'd be hard-pressed to find a document with a spottier past. And remember, if that statement gets your panties in a knot, it's because you were culturally conditioned to respond to a symbol. That's how these things work, for better or worse. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing per se. I mean, it's how mantras work. It's how all symbols work. It's how they become helpful to you. It's why you love and care for the people and things that you love and care for. It's not that they have intrinsic value or meaning. There's no objective value in these things, but they mean something to us. So we act as if. The real issue for me personally is that some people need it to mean something to everyone. And they do this because they are scared and they need their version of reality constantly reinforced, or they'll just fall apart and go into ontological shock. And though it sounds like a slight, it's not really a slight. I mean, it's the whole game of having a human body and being on this planet. It's all symbols to our mind, right? The mind places values on them. That's how this works. It's part of the human curriculum. Belief is an important thing to have when it comes to unlocking your inner ability to alter your reality. Belief is a non-quantifiable thought exercise, but a lot of us need it so that we can tap into our own ability. It's not for nothing, right? And just because it's not objectively real doesn't mean it's nothing. And I realize that I'm going off on a whole thing here, but it's important. In fact, let me explain it this way. If you have an ego, which you do, you have an ego. And a feature of that ego is called reality testing, which essentially means that you think that you are a separate person, okay? And since that's the case, we think, the operative word being think, that we are separate from God. Because that's what a lifetime in the thinking mind does. It separates things. Now, when you have faith in something or someone, it's not that person, that place, or that thing that got you through. It was the power of your own belief that unlocked that aspect of you that was able to shift reality. It wasn't because you went to the special building once a week and said the special thing. It was your belief in that thing. And the converse is true as well. You just got to find your way through this shit. That's all there is to it. You find a thing that works for you and you let it work for you. It doesn't have to work for everyone, especially religion. Well, that is, unless you've neutered your concept of God by removing the divine feminine, which results in your religion becoming more of a political party of rules rather than spirituality. I'd like to point out that the Catholic Church did some weird shit with Mary that I talk about in a later episode. But, removing the divine feminine from, or removing its specialness, I think is a big fucking mistake. Now, the word devil, because the concept of Shaitan, the accuser, the adversary, is obviously in the Hebrew Bible. However, the character in the word quote unquote devil were not. The devil, the horned, fiery, goat-footed ruler of hell, is not in the original Bible. He doesn't even exist in early Christianity. He's an invention created between the 5th and 12th centuries. He's a composite of Pan, Cernunnos, the Celtic forest guy, and satyrs, the underworld gods, Persian dualism, medieval Christian fears, all of it balled up into one, and then you get like this devil thing. Really what happened was the church took like all of the local gods of the people, the ones they loved, the ones tied to nature, fertility, joy, music, freedom, and turned those gods into the devil. And why would they do that? Because the greatest threat to centralized religion is a population that still worships nature, intuition, and direct experience. You can't control people who believe that in the sacredness of the forest, that believe in the sacredness of their breath, of their body, of their own awareness. And that's how Pan becomes Satan, the adversary. The green man, Cernunnos, of the Celtics becomes the evil one. Now, understanding the separation between Lucifer, Satan, and the devil does something incredibly important for us. I believe that it proves that this wasn't spiritual. This wasn't a spiritual decision. It was a political one. It shows the mechanics of how the light gets rewritten as darkness. Remember, inverting meaning. That is, if you want to call something evil and satanic, let's call it inverting words, right? How a teacher becomes a villain, how the independent seeker becomes the enemy of the system. Once you see that Lucifer is not Satan and Satan is not the devil is not Lucifer, you can finally see the pattern clearly. When the power structure is trying to centralize things to make it easier to control, the benevolent characters in the story that the people idolize, characters like Prometheus, become cautionary tales. The fear of illumination was engineered. The demonization of awakening was intentional. There is never one cosmic enemy. There is only one reoccurring target, and that target is human consciousness. It's human freedom. They can't have that. Lucifer isn't Satan. Satan isn't the devil, and the devil was stitched together from pagan gods the church needed people to be afraid of. Once you see the edits, you realize the story was never about evil. It was about controlling who gets to hold the light. So, when we finally get to the word Lucifer itself, it's not in the New Testament or even in Jewish scripture. It's in Isaiah 14:12. The original Hebrew phrase is Hallel ben Shahar, shining one, son of the dawn. It's a poetic taunt, and it was aimed at the king of Babylon because he was very arrogant and claimed divine status. It's political satire. It's not fucking theology. Again, notice, it's politics. It's not spirituality. But this guy, St. Jerome, translated the Hebrew Bible into Latin. He used the Latin word Lucifer, literally light bringer, to represent Hallel. So now we have this single line referring to a fallen morning star. Then later, church guys read that verse through the lens of the Enoch story. So now we got fallen angels, we got pride, rebellion, fused them all together. So by the 4th and 5th century, Lucifer had transformed from the morning star into Satan himself. That's how translation and politics can rewrite an entire archetype. Think about that for a second. That is so fucking crazy. One political jab, and you have a new character. And I think that's interesting, to say the least. So here's a fascinating little nugget. In Roman culture, Lucifer was still a positive name. It was another title for the planet Venus, that star that rises before dawn. Early Christians referred to Jesus as the morning star, the Lucifer. And another Bible verse for you, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 19, it says, "We also have the prophetic message as something completely reliable, and you will do well to pay attention to it, as to a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts." Then verse 20, "Above all, you must understand that no prophecy of Scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation of things." Verse 2, "For prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets, though human, spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." And then we can get into, let's see, here's another one. Revelation 22:16, it says, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star." So for a while there, both Jesus and the devil were calling themselves the same thing. The light bringer. That duality is not an accident. It's symbolic of the human split between divinity and fear. Again, these things have allegory to them. If you read them literally, they're not that interesting. It's between knowing, capital K, and obeying. And that is a very interesting difference. So by the Middle Ages, art and literature had cemented the word Lucifer, in Latin meaning morning star, Venus light bringer, as the archetype of rebellion. Then with Milton's book Paradise Lost in the 1600s, the story gets fully psychological. The angel who refuses to serve, who would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, is named Lucifer. Thanks, Milton. So by then, the Lucifer archetype was already being grafted onto another character, the nature spirit Pan. So you see what's happening. This is political. And in my opinion, this is what happens when you remove spirituality, the divine feminine, from a religious practice or belief. You just have a bunch of fucking rules. You have legislation, not spirituality. You have politics. So once the lines between politics and religion get blurred, you're cooked. You're done. You're now unreliable, because to politicize it, you will eventually have to violate religious beliefs to maintain political order and control. And if their religious beliefs were so important, they, the politicians, would rather lose ground politically than violate the religious principles. But they don't do it that way because there is no spirit, no potency, no belief system. That's why it's just legislation. Religion without hridaya, the spiritual heart. It's just rules now. In fact, if you want to get really deep, is Lucifer, Satan, the devil, is that an egregore? Go back to the episode on egregores or just Google it. But would it be possible to say that's what's happening? Or a tulpa, created out of the fear of the loss of control by these people? I think that's a very interesting thing to think about, considering the duality didn't really exist in that system until they stumbled upon Zoroastrianism. I think it's a interesting thought exercise. Now, I'm sorry this isn't totally linear, but before the Christian devil ever existed in art, there was Pan. In Greek mythology, Pan is the god of the wild, half man, half goat, the symbol of nature's vitality, instinct, and fertility. His name literally means all. Interesting. But he represents the totality of the natural world, the forests, the fields, the rivers, the raw creative life force. People feared him, yes, but they also loved him. His presence could cause panic, but that trembling sense of awe that the sacred power of nature has. He was never evil per se. He was just spooky, right? I mean, you go to the ocean and you see these waves and the raw power of the ocean. It's not evil, it's just nature. So when Christianity begins to spread across Europe and encountered the old gods of the countryside, Pan, Cyrnanos, or Kyrnanos, however you pronounce it, and the other horned deities of fertility and wilderness. So to the church, these gods were a threat. They represented a spirituality that was decentralized. It was rooted in nature and direct experience. It was rooted in direct experience. So the image of Pan, the horns, the hooves, the beard, the flute, was merged with the newly constructed image of Satan. So that's how you get that. So the wild, sensual, joyful god of the earth was turned into the tempter, the corrupter, the fallen angel. Think about that inversion. Again, we have this inversion thing. The god of the forest becomes the prince of darkness. The symbol of life becomes the emblem of death. Nature itself becomes suspect. And the church had to do that. Because if you can convince people that nature, that their bodies, that their instincts, that their joy is sinful, then you can control them. You sever them from their own divinity. That's how the archetype of Lucifer, the light bringer, and the image of Pan, the spirit of freedom, both get wrapped up together in this massive cultural rebranding called the devil. They're two sides of the same archetype. The free, knowing, ungoverned human spirit. So over time, both Lucifer and Pan became symbols of everything the institutional church couldn't control. sexuality, knowledge, personal illumination, ecstatic union with nature, and the individual's direct relationship with the divine, a direct experience, a direct relationship. That is a problem when the control system requires you to go through an intermediary to talk to God. Your direct experience and revelation gathered from divine connection to the higher self is an outright threat to the power structure. I remember a time once when I was doing some goofy certification, and they started asking people the question, what's the difference in religion and spirituality? And I kept my hand down. I didn't want to even get into this mess. And finally, the guy that was facilitating the group goes, Keith, what do you think? And I was like, no, it's cool. I don't know, man. I don't know. You got to know something. You got to have an opinion. And I said, well, since you're pressing me, religion is your belief in someone else's experience, and spirituality is a belief in your own experience. And that was upsetting. So, the Lightbringer and the Horned God were demonized not because they were evil, but because they represented the same dangerous truth, that you don't need a middleman between you and God. You are capable of direct experience. You are the temple, the altar, the fire, the offering. Everything you do is that. And that's the central theme running through the Asuras to Prometheus, to the Watchers, to Lucifer, to Pan, the eternal struggle between centralized power and personal awakening. Every age finds a new way to tell the same story. That light has got to be contained and that human freedom is dangerous. The Christian devil wasn't born in hell. He was stolen from the forest. The horns, the hooves, the fire, that was Pan, the god of nature, the wild, the free. The church turned him into Satan because Pan didn't need a priest. He was the reminder that you are wild and free and that you and nature are one. Now, before the devil was a creature of fire, before he lived underground, and before he carried all of the imagery, the devil was completely different. In fact, if you saw him, you might think he was cute because he was green, he was earthy, he was wild. And that little detail, you think it's just color. You think it's nothing. And this is what they do. They change these things a little bit and you think it's nothing. But that color change tells a story about how the church rewrote not a myth, but the entire relationship that humans had with nature. Our relationship with sexuality, instinct, the forest, the body. The devil wasn't always red. He became red. And that transition from green to red is one of the clearest examples of how these spiritual control systems, these power structures, reshape symbols in order to reshape humanity. In the earliest visual ancestry of the devil, the quote-unquote devil, he wasn't a demon. He was Pan. He was Kiernanos. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. The green man, that guy the head you always see on the sides of trees, these Celtic gods. They were the gods of nature, the gods of fertility, of ecstasy, wildness, instinct, forest, life force. They weren't evil. They were the beloved gods of shepherds, farmers, healers, lovers, dancers, musicians, and mountain people. Pan's skin was always painted green, the color of the forest, of moss, leaves, the earth, fertility, and rebirth. Demons in early medieval manuscripts were also painted green. And not because green meant evil, but because green meant that it was outside of Christian order. Green meant untamed. To the church, it meant unregulated, belonging to the old religion, the old gods. And this is important to understand. Green didn't mean Satan. It meant freedom. It meant spirituality outside the church. And that could not stand. So between the 12th and 15th centuries, the church strategically recolored the devil from green, which means nature, to red, which is essentially hellfire, for two specific reasons. One, to break Europe's connection to the nature-based religions. The church wanted to eliminate forest worship, pagan rites, fertility rituals, ecstatic dance, druidic traditions, local gods. I mean, if people believed that the sacred lived in the forest, then you couldn't control them from the cathedral. In fact, you couldn't even get them all in one place. right? You couldn't herd the flock, as it were, into their pen. They would be all undomesticated, wild people living in the countryside. So the visual message had to change. Nature, the green world, becomes dangerous. Hell, the red world, becomes the new home of the devil. Green equals sacred in pagan culture. Red equals forbidden in Christian symbolism. This color switch rewired everyone's subconscious mind. And the second reason, to associate the devil with hell instead of earth. Red meant fire, punishment, sin, blood, fear, damnation, a perfect color for their propaganda. So the goal was simple. Stop people from seeing divinity in nature and start seeing danger in nature. Pan becomes Satan. Kyrnanos becomes the devil. The forest becomes the place of temptation. The body becomes sinful. Sexuality, a suspect. Instinct becomes dangerous. And the devil becomes a fiery red warning label against connection to the human spirit. The recoloring of the devil wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It wasn't seen through revelation from God. It was a metaphor for everything we've been talking about in this episode. It symbolizes the moment where the church rebrands. They rebrand freedom as danger. I mean, don't you want to be safe? I mean, if so, you should listen to us. We'll tell you where to go, what to do, and more importantly, what God wants from you, since we're the only ones that are really qualified to deliver this message. Freedom isn't safety. So you got to ask yourself, do you want to be free or do you want to be safe? And the next thing would be nature. They rebranded nature as temptation. Pan is nature. Pan is temptation. Nature is temptation. Instinct is a sin. Direct experience, they rebranded that one as evil and demonic. Because that paranormal experience or that mystical experience that you had, remember that? That was a demonic entity, or Satan himself, tempting you with that ecstatic state. And those tears of joy that you cried because just for a moment you saw how connected it all was. That was a message from the devil as well. That was a demon trying to take your soul, because everyone knows it's evil to see connection in all things. And it's more Jesus-like to see separation in the world, right? I mean, everyone knows that. What are you, stupid? And then they recast knowledge as rebellion. And then light as dark. It's the inversion of things. You want to talk about what's evil? Think about that. The inversion of words. This entire world, our life is made up of language. The mind knows what something is because of the words we use to describe it. It's how we interact with everything. What's darker than changing that? Think about that for a second. Put our current cultural situation through all that. That is fucking dark. So the concept of the character of Lucifer, the light bringer, of the trickster, of Pan, didn't just get demonized through theology. They got demonized through art, through color and symbolism. The church repainted the archetype so the psychological impact would hit immediately, even for people who couldn't read. Because remember, this was all in Latin until Martin Luther changed that, right? No one knew what any of this shit even said. This is one of the purest examples of how institutional power rewrites the inner world by rewriting the outer symbols. If you can control the symbols, you can control the mind. If you can redefine light as evil, the people will stop seeking it. That's why the devil needed to turn red. That's why Prometheus needed to be punished, because with Pan, the forest is sacred. With Prometheus, knowledge is power, right? Because the body is too powerful. The heart is too free. They cannot have that. The devil wasn't red. He was green. He was Pan, the god of nature, instinct, freedom. The church repainted him because you can't control people who find the sacred in the forest outside of the institute, outside of the building, outside of the institution. The color changed so the story could change. That's it. And that is evil. Now, if you've been following this thread, and I know it's been a lot, if you followed it from the Asuras to Prometheus, to the Watchers, to Lucifer, to Pan, you can already see that something major happened somewhere along the way. It wasn't just that they changed a myth, that they altered a story. It was that consciousness itself had changed. And I mean consciousness with a little c, consciousness as a cognitive faculty of the mind, right? Consciousness in this sense is what you are and are not aware of. It's the reference material that the mind uses to create your external world. So these changes, these manipulations, added phenomena to the mind of humans, to the thoughts of the people. It created new ways of thinking, and not in some new, fun, exciting way, but instead in the way people thought about why bad things happen. Now it's not your fault. Now it's not the individual's fault or the government's fault. It's the devil's fault. It's not that the nature of all things is to be impermanent and in a constant state of decomposition, and the fact that sometimes that decomposition is painful and wretched, but now you have someone or something to blame. You can now blame the devil, no more personal responsibility or self-reliance. You don't have to get into the complicated process of questioning God or the intentions of God, or at least the Western Judeo-Christian concept of God. Now, the devil created cancer. The devil created heart disease, and that's why Grandma died. Which is odd, since the power structure that created this character will say that you had free will, so you should have done something else. But when it comes to them having to explain the problems of the world, they will just blame this devil thing. And remember, they, the power structure, the architects of the control system, positioned themselves as the moral and spiritual authorities. And the children in Sunday school, the mentally lazy adults or the mentally immature amongst us bought in. Thank God we don't have to question the motives of God. Now we can just blame something. I mean, how many of us as kids were told by the adults, the leaders, the taller humans in the room, that Lucifer was the devil and that he was cast out of heaven with a bunch of angels because he wanted to overthrow God? That's what I was told. And as an adult, have had other adults look me in the eye and say that to me as well. I'll move on, but damn. So, somewhere between 800 BCE and 400 BCE, the world went through what historians sometimes call the Axial Age. This was a period where civilizations all over the world began moving away from mystical, experiential spirituality and towards centralized, institutional religion. This is when empires like Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Rome, and later the great dynasties of India and China rose up. But with empires comes laws, taxes, armies, and control. And if you're going to have all that, well, control needs a story to support it. And religion becomes that story. Before this time, the spiritual life was intimate. It was local. It was often ecstatic. People worshipped in nature with rituals that reflected the rhythms of the earth. There were male and, more importantly, female shamans, healers, oracles, men and women who claimed direct access to the divine. But empires don't like direct access. Empires like a chain of command. Military like chains of command. Policy. Structure like in a fucking corporation. So religion begins to mirror the structure of the state. One God, one king, one law, one priesthood, and with that comes a new moral framework. Now you have dualism. Good versus evil. Obedience versus rebellion. Light versus darkness. And the result, everything that used to be sacred and personal, knowledge, sex, nature, even laughter, becomes regulated. The old gods of nature become devils, the shamans become heretics, the mysteries become the property of the priesthood. And underneath, all of it runs the same psychological current. Fear of chaos, fear of disobedience, fear of one's own power. I mean, dualism is simple. It's clean and it's structured. Who's responsible for the good things and who's responsible for the bad things? Nice and tidy. So if you read the old myths in their original order, you can see this story of control begin to unfold in real time. In India, the Asuras, once the lords of wisdom, are now considered the enemies of the Devas. They're demons. In Greece, Prometheus is punished for helping humans evolve. He goes from being a hero of humanity to a cautionary tale about what happens when you go against Olympus, the control system, the power structure. In the Near East, the Watchers are chained beneath the earth for helping humans and then falling in love with them. They're punished for that. And in Christianity, the word light bringer, Lucifer, is now condemned and turned into some demonic name or the name of some demon, which I always find hilarious. And in Europe, Pan is recast as Satan. So you go from being the embodiment of everything wild and free to being Satan. I mean, you want to be wild and free, right? Or do you want your new surrogate parents, God, the church, the politicians, to keep you safe? I mean, it's up to you. What do you want? Just kidding. It's actually not up to you. You're going to be forced into the system at some level or another, so you might as well accept it. You see, every one of these transformations corresponds with a stage in human centralization, the moment when free inquiry gives way to dogma. And isn't dogma nice? You don't have to think for yourself. Whether it's political dogma or religious dogma, you can just check the rule book and see what your opinion should be. See, that's nice, right? They've done all the thinking for you. You don't even have to consider it. But isn't it funny when your prescribed dogmatic point of view is misaligned with your feelings, with your gut? When people begin to say, don't ask, just believe. That's when you see that light, knowledge, has become very dangerous. When we talk about the fall of Lucifer, which again wasn't one of the angels, or the binding of the Watchers, what if we're not talking about celestial events at all? What if we're describing something that happened in the human psyche? Maybe the real fall wasn't angels leaving heaven. Maybe it was humanity falling into spiritual amnesia because slowly over time they conditioned us out of our connection to our true nature. Lucifer's light wasn't cast out of heaven, right? It was cast out of human consciousness. The mind was luminous and inwardly connected. And then it becomes this fragmented thing, fragmented with spiritual dualism. It was divided between the sacred and the profane, the good and evil, holy and sinful. And when that happened, it created a perfect world for control to flourish because now there is a punishment and a reward. If people are taught that God is somewhere out there, then you can sell access. And the exchange in that selling isn't with money, it's with safety and control. Just think about this. In the world, but not of the world. In the body, but not of the body. A foot in the soul and a foot in the body. A foot in heaven and a foot in the world. A foot in the divine mind, the mind of the soul, and a foot in the scared small self, the conscious mind, the mind of the body, the organism. Well, the mind of the body separates things. That's the job of the ego. The feature of the human ego, known as reality testing, to be specific. It's a feature that promotes the propagation of the species. It makes sense. We wouldn't procreate if we believed or knew that we were all one thing. So reality testing has to be a thing. The ego is necessary. So when we view God or the divine as something outside of us, something out there, something to be earned and different from us, then we are looking at it through the lens of the human ego. Being separate from God is completely egoic, but also a necessary obstacle in the human curriculum, something to get over and realize our connection to know that we are an emanation of God, of the source of all things. There is only one God, and we are it. You know, you say this to folks and they tighten up. but in the same breath, talk about the omnipresence of God. Okay, so let's go with that. God is omnipresent, all pervasive. So now tell me where God stops and starts. You tell me. You go ahead and put your limitations on it. Anyway, I'll leave that right there for you to think about. No pun intended. So, with this data pack about a devil out there trying to thwart your success being inserted into the consciousness of humans, you can almost feel the psychological shift take hold around this time. Instead of priests guiding people toward their own personal experience, they become gatekeepers. Instead of myths being maps for transformation, they become the rules for obedience. They become a series of cautionary tales or historical facts. And this is the turning point that still echoes through every spiritual tradition today. It's why people still feel like they're doing something wrong when they start to meditate or question the doctrine. It's why mystics and reformers are always treated like threats, because they point people back to their own inner authority. That's why figures like the Buddha, Socrates, and countless others were misunderstood, because their message wasn't follow me, it was see for yourself. But see for yourself is the most dangerous phrase in history, because if you truly see for yourself, no one can rule you through fear ever again, because now you know. You know better now. How many times have you heard someone say that those deep, moving spiritual experiences had by others were just demons or Satan pulling them away from their faith? That's like telling someone that prefers the handling of a Porsche over a Chevy that fascism is drawing them away from the American exceptionalism. It's just stupid. At the end of the day, the empires didn't outlaw magic or heresy because they feared demons. They outlawed them because they fear free thinkers. Every time someone says, see for yourself, have your own experience, a control system dies just a little. That's what this whole story is really about. It's about a battle between direct knowledge and direct experience and this mediated knowledge, this borrowed knowledge, between inner revelation and outer authority. And if you strip away the ancient names, the myths, and the symbolism, the battle is still happening right now. We just call it something else. It's in the way the media tells you what to think, the way these systems reward conformity, the way you hesitate before speaking. Every time you feel that tension, that pull between the desire to know and the fear of being wrong, you're feeling the ancient war between light and control play out in your own mind. You've been doing this forever. It's very familiar. So the question becomes, what does it mean to rebel now? Not against God, but against ignorance. What does it mean to be a light bringer in a world that still fears its own illumination, its own direct experience? I struggle with this all the time. There are things that I believe are true about life, but I hesitate to proclaim them either out of diplomacy or what Buddhism would call idiot compassion. I guess in a way, this episode is part of that. Maybe I'm not talking to you at all. Maybe this entire thing is for me because I'm still trying to come to terms with the religious trauma of my childhood and the lies. Because the deeper you dig, you're like, this doesn't even make any sense. Back to the Batman-Superman thing, that only makes sense because Batman had a suit made out of kryptonite. The myth has to have some continuity. You can't just sling shit around and tell everybody to believe it. So, by now, we've seen how the light bringer, whether we call him Lucifer, Prometheus, or an Asura, or Semyaza, was turned into the villain as humanity moved towards centralized control. But not every tradition did that. Some kept the light alive. So let's start with the Gnostics. Now, I don't believe in their cosmology. It's the belief that the material world was created by an inferior entity called the demiurge. They essentially believe that this is some sort of a mistake, that we all need to figure a way out of this thing. So we're once again blaming the discomfort and pain of the human experience on some other quote-unquote bad guy that we can all blame. Moreover, they believe that the female aspect of God, Sophia, believed that she didn't need no man or male aspect and tried to create the world without him, which resulted in the demiurge. And this mistake that they believe to be the material world was made by Sophia. So now we have two things that I find foolish. They've removed or at least demonized the divine feminine, and they've blamed something else, a la the devil. So if you don't know, the Gnostics were early Christian mystics, and if you really read what they wrote, you start to see why the church needed them gone. They believed that divine knowledge, gnosis, was available to everyone, not through priests or rituals, but through direct revelation, direct experience. So that's interesting. Again, we're back at this place where no, on the direct experience. They also flipped the script entirely. So as I started to say, in their cosmology, the being who created the physical world, the one we usually think of as God, wasn't the ultimate divine source at all. He was the demiurge, a blind craftsman who thought he was the only God. The real God, they said, was beyond all of that, was infinite, unknowable, pure light, and the one who brought humanity the knowledge of that higher reality. The serpent in the garden, the bringer of light, wasn't the villain. He was trying to liberate us. He tried to do it through the divine feminine, through Eve, but we put a stop to that. To the Gnostics, Lucifer, the serpent or Satan, was the same archetype as Prometheus, a divine messenger that was trying to wake humanity up from this spiritual amnesia. But to the early church, this was heresy. Because if the quote-unquote God of the Bible could be questioned, then so could the men who proclaimed to speak to him or for him. So the Gnostics were hunted, their texts destroyed or buried until 1945, when a jar of ancient scrolls was found in the Egyptian desert. That's how the Nag Hammadi library came to light. And in those texts, you can still read the same message, especially in the Gospel of Thomas. It says, "The kingdom of God is within you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known." That's Gnostic Jesus talking, not the authoritarian figure used to justify hierarchy, but the teacher of inner realization. The Gnostics kept the Luciferian light alive because they understood that true knowledge can't be handed to you. It has to awaken within you. Now, in Buddhism, you don't really see this moral dualism, this war between good and evil. Instead, you see an understanding of consciousness itself as the battlefield. When the Buddha sits beneath the Bodhi tree and vows not to move until he's awakened, who shows up? Mara. Mara isn't a devil in the Christian sense. He's not an independent being of evil. He's temptation. He's distraction, fear, and desire, the internal forces that keep us trapped in ignorance. When the Buddha faces Mara, he's really facing the parts of himself that don't want to wake up. The same inner Zeus that chained Prometheus, the same inner Yahweh that casts out the Watchers, the same inner church that tells you not to trust your own experience. But here's the difference. The Buddha doesn't banish Mara. He sees through him. He realizes that Mara has no power, only the power we give him. And once he understands that, Mara disappears. That's the Buddhist way of dealing with the archetype of quote-unquote evil, by understanding it as part of the mind's process of awakening. The quote-unquote demons aren't outside of us. They're aspects of the self. They're not enemies to be feared. They're teachers to be understood. Imagine if Western religion had kept that understanding. We wouldn't need to fear Lucifer or Pan or even the word devil. We'd understand them as symbols of our own untamed consciousness, forces that, when integrated, become sources of wisdom. And that is an interesting shift, because you now Now you don't need these surrogate parents, these priests and pastors and politicians to protect you from evil. Never forget, if some or a board of someone's only gets paid if you have a problem, then that means they probably feed on relevancy, which means that they probably need to remain relevant. And if that's the case, well, maybe they're the ones creating the problem so that they can then sell you the solution, right? It's classic. It's the classic big pharma story. Now let's speed forward to today, present era. Today we don't chain Prometheus to a rock. We don't burn witches. We don't outlaw meditation, at least not in most places. But the control system evolved. Today it's psychological. It's digital. It's cultural. It's in the way we're taught to outsource our authority to the media, politics, whatever spiritual trend is trending this week. It's in the way we're told that happiness is a product, that enlightenment is a subscription, and that truth is whatever gets the most engagement. After all, if something has millions of likes, then it must be true, right? Or is that what we call consensus reality? So the modern priesthood, the Pharisees aren't wearing robes, they're wearing logos. The family altar is now the flat glass god at the front of the living room or some deity that you carry in your pocket. Every scroll, every notification, every outrage cycle, all of it keeps us distracted from the same inner light that Lucifer, the Watchers, and the Gnostics tried to remind us of. And so the story continues. The light bringers still fall. The knowledge still gets twisted. And yet there's always that moment, that flicker of awareness when you catch yourself remembering who you are. It's the moment of rebellion, that Luciferian spark. It's not about worshiping an entity or believing in fallen angels. It's about reclaiming your right to see, to question, to awaken without permission, without fear of damnation. Questions don't mean you don't believe. A good friend of mine said, faith requires doubt, because the kingdom of God really is within you. If it is, then so is the light bringer. Now, before I bring this whole thing home, I want to look at one more character, one more personality, if you will. I want to talk about Krishna. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't steal knowledge from the heavens. He is the heavens, walking among humanity. He gives Arjuna not a set of commandments or laws or legislation, but he gives Arjuna direct experience. He reveals himself as the source of all that is, the fire, the sun, the birth, the death, the peace, the horror, the breath of all beings, the infinite spark. And in that moment, Arjuna's illusion falls away. It's the same light that Prometheus, Enki, and the Watchers tried to bring, but this time it's understood. Krishna doesn't rebel against God. He embodies it. He is it. And the knowledge he gives isn't forbidden. It's liberating. He tells Arjuna, whenever dharma declines, righteousness, whenever it declines, and adharma, or unrighteousness, rises, I manifest myself. That's the same archetype as Prometheus. It's the same as the Watchers, as Pan, as Lucifer. The light descending into form to awaken consciousness. But unlike the Western versions, Krishna's story takes place in a culture that never severed the divine from the world. Where Western religion says, don't touch the fire, Krishna says, you are the fire. The difference is one of relationship. Lucifer represents the awakening that challenges authority. Krishna represents the awakening that transcends authority. It's a big difference. One is the mind realizing its power, and the other is the soul realizing its source. And when you see that, you realize that these aren't opposing forces. They're stages of the same awakening. They are steps in a process of waking up. First, the rebel questions the system. Then the devotee surrenders the ego. Both are acts of liberation. That's why the Gita isn't a book about escape or renunciation. It's actually about action with awareness. Krishna doesn't tell Arjuna to abandon the battlefield and renounce violence. He can't, because that's Arjuna's role. He's a warrior. It's his job. He is a Shastriya, the warrior class. Instead, Krishna tells him to fight consciously, without attachment. Do what you do because that is your duty, and let the chips fall where they may. That's the same spiritual freedom that Prometheus and the Watchers wanted to give humanity, but with the added realization that the battlefield isn't out there, it's within. That's the allegory. Krishna's message completes the arc that these beings started. The movement from rebellion to revelation, from separation to union, it's the same light seen through different lenses. Wisdom doesn't fear it. It understands it as the essence of divinity itself. Mara in Buddhism isn't a devil. He's your fear. The Watchers weren't demons, they were teachers. Lucifer isn't the enemy, he's the light bringer. Every age changes the names, but it's always the same story. Someone tries to wake us up, and we call them evil. Someone tries to shine a light on the path, and we kill them. So at this point, you've probably noticed that what we're really talking about isn't good and evil. It's really about the struggle between authority and awakening. As the great Timothy Leary said, human beings have a right to change their consciousness, and it's unconscionable and absolutely wrong for any government or any person to stand in the way. Every story we've explored, whether it was the Asuras, Prometheus, the Watchers, the Word, Lucifer, Pan, it has all been about the same thing. Someone stepping outside of the structure, someone daring to see for themselves. And every institution since the dawn of civilization has had one primary mission: to make sure that you don't. Because the moment you see the divine as something inside of you instead of some other thing or someone above you, you become ungovernable. And that's not blasphemy, that's freedom. When I talk about decentralizing spirituality, that's what I mean. Returning it to its rightful place inside of your own awareness. You don't need a priest to tell you that the sunrise is holy. You don't need a guru to confirm that love is sacred. You don't need an authority to grant you permission to know yourself. You are already standing in the temple. You are already holding the light of Prometheus. The infinite spark of being isn't an organization or a brand. It's a reminder. It's the whisper that says everything you're looking for is already within you. The idea of Lucifer, the Lightbringer, isn't an invitation to rebel against God. It's an invitation to remember that God has never been separate from you. It's the inner voice that says, question everything, even me. It's the moment you stop believing and start knowing. Once you stop the egoic pursuit of trying to find truth outside of yourself, you start to see it everywhere. That's what the myths were pointing to. That this light doesn't belong to any one or one being or one belief system. It's the same light moving through all of us, through all systems. See, the problem was never Lucifer, this character that got its name from an Italian translation of a political joke about a Babylonian king. The problem was forgetting what light actually means. The problem is that our culture looks to these texts for historical accuracy like a bunch of children that need Star Wars to be a fucking documentary, when the truth of it is that if you're looking to liberate yourself, if you're looking for truth, real deep spiritual truths about life, about what it is to inhabit the human experience, then you have to understand the allegory of these texts. Because when you begin to do that, you realize that what we've been told about a lot of this is completely backwards. Again, they've inverted it. They've inverted the truth. And that is evil. You know, when I was a kid, the Inquirer, this tabloid, which was probably a CIA psyop, would have these stories every week about how they found Noah's Ark. Well, who cares? But there was a flood and every culture has a story. Yeah, so what? What in the actual fuck does that have to do with anything other than it being a fascinating story about the human will that, despite being a degenerate alcoholic, God will still pick you to build a giant boat that then would be filled with 2 of every animal from the entire planet. You know, and not to turn this into the point of this rant is that the need for this to be objectively true or objectively real, you Christian folks out there, is what's fucking you up. Who cares if you find relics? Who cares if you find wood and shrouds and all this other shit? That's not the point, stupid. That's not the point of a spiritual system. The point isn't to be the overarching truth of the fucking universe. This is an internal thing. This is what all of the, what some of you might consider satanic occult practices. What they know is that this isn't about an external shift. It's about an internal one. And do you realize that as a child, I was told that all the animals on the planet knew where to go to get to Noah to get on this fucking boat? Do you know how dumb that sounded to me, even as a kid? And then you grow up, right? And then these adults, these half-cocked, dull-minded Christian apologists like Wes Huff that don't dodge the question, because a lot of them do, the question of, hey, do you think he built a big boat and put all the animals on it? And they say shit like, well, no. I mean, it could be a metaphor, maybe not all the animals. Really? Yeah, I mean, not everything in the Bible's meant to be literal. I love when they say that, because then it's like, okay, which part? Who is the person that is deciding which is a metaphor and which is a Kevin Burns style PBS documentary put onto papyrus? Because there's no answer key to that, and it's never addressed. And the only reason they believe, or you, is because they, or you, are more afraid of the punishment, just in case it's real. That belief isn't the result of earnest truth-seeking. At best, it's the equivalent of watching one movie ever and then deciding based on limited exposure and what other people told you about movies that it's the best movie. Actually, it would be more accurate to say that they watched half of a movie, half of one movie. And you know how I know that it's only half of the movie? Because of the sheer amount of misquoting and misrepresentation that happens to the Bible at the hands of Christians. I had one do it today. It'll take me off into a whole thing. I can't do it. But anyway, I've been at this whole spiritual seeking thing for 29 years. And I started it out of a sense of urgency and curiosity, because if any of this is to be true, then that makes it pretty fucking important. And if you're going to seek truth, then you have to be ready to find out that your truth, as the kids would say nowadays, since truth is apparently just a personal thing, you have to be ready to find out that A, you're not right, B, what you believe isn't true, and C, everything might be right here in front of you. And all of this also applies to politics. And that's scary, because that means that self-reliance and personal responsibility are 2 of the main teachings here. That there's no one singular cosmic villain out there thwarting your success or killing babies and making grandma sick. And just because it's painful for you or hard for you to conceptualize doesn't mean that it's an act of evil from some force. I'll give you another thoughtful gem bestowed onto me by the theologians of the church that I went to as a child. I want to say her name so bad, but I'm not going to. The devil has to ask for permission to do bad things to you. Now, roll that one around in your 5-year-old or 6-year-old brain. So all those bad things that the devil does to you, he has permission. Oh, that's not fucked up at all. So, pardon me. Let's get back on track. This isn't rebellion for its own sake. It's awareness. It's seeing things as they are, even when it's uncomfortable. It's refusing to live on borrowed truth, or worse, borrowed experience. And when you live that way, you begin to see, you feel that stirring, you feel it inside of you. That is the infinite spark of being. That's the fire, the technology that all of these so-called fallen beings, those cautionary tales were trying to give us. I don't believe that these teachings were taught through allegory and metaphor to hide them from the powers that be because these evil people didn't want humanity to wake up. I don't believe that at all. That's more the same old Western Judaic Christian punishment reward shit. They were taught as allegory because that's how we learn. For God's sakes, that's how we teach children. First, you tell a story that is basic right and wrong, okay? Then once they, the followers or the kids, whoever, learn the rules, you can teach them the deeper meaning. And you do that because not everyone has ears to hear the deeper truth. But at least the ones that can't hear it or can't see it, at the very least, they'll have a set of rules to follow so they don't just go hurting each other. And then everyone else gets to find the deeper meaning, but at least everyone else that's left is not a maniac. So maybe the real war to protect your freedom isn't some external conflict with these externalized forces. Maybe the battlefield is in the mind. Maybe there's a battle between the part of you that seeks truth and the part of you that's afraid of what the truth might be. No one was trying to turn anyone against God. At least not the true God. I mean, maybe they were trying to wake up humanity to a control system created by a control-obsessed power structure. Or maybe, just maybe, they were showing humanity that the path to God doesn't go up, but instead it goes in. I love you. Stay awake. Thank you. If the infinite spark of being has brought you any value, consider supporting the work. And you can do that by checking out Awake and the 90-Day Transformation Journal, both now available on Amazon. The links are in the description. If you want to support this work on a monthly basis, there are $10, $15, and $20 Patreon tiers that have no locked content yet, just support. You can also swing by the website, check out the merch store, learn more about working with me one-on-one, and as always, the YouTube page has full episodes as well as binaural beats to help you with your practice. So I'll see you next week. Thank you, and I love you.